Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 2, Conflicts and Challenges in Canada 1800 to 1850. This is Lesson Number 13, What Was Life Like in a Town? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. What do you think life was like in a town in the 1800s? How would life be similar or different than it is today? Put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question, and we'll talk about our responses in tomorrow's class. All right, let's proceed. Believe it or not, towns in the 1800s had busy streets, just like today. The streets were very muddy, and people had to watch out for horses instead of cars. Those people who lived in towns had many opportunities to create relationships since they lived so close to each other. This led to the creation of strong communities. The larger, more established communities were located on the East Coast and in Lower Canada. Societies can be organized using a class structure. Class structure is a way of ordering society based on social or economic status. The upper class of society is made of the wealthiest people who have the most power. In Upper and Lower Canada, the upper class came from Britain. They often inherited a lot of money from their families. They worked as government officials, bankers, lawyers, and merchants. And as the wife of the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Elizabeth Simcoe was quite wealthy. She wrote about the beauty she saw in Upper Canada. Here's a question for you, though. How do you think her writing would be different if she was not from the upper class? Do you think that she would see the same beauty in Upper Canada that members of the upper class saw? People who lived in Canadian towns had access to many goods and services. However, only the wealthy could afford to pay for these goods and services. They could afford to hire servants and send their children to school. The wealthy could buy the best food and clothing. Since they had servants, the wealthy had more free time and could attend parties with their friends. Just looking at this picture here on the left, you might want to put the video on pause once I finish speaking so you can get a better look at this picture. Can you tell which people in this painting are from the upper class and which people are from the middle and lower classes? If so, how can you tell the differences by looking at this painting? Many people in the Canadas in the 1800s belonged to the middle and lower classes. Compared to the upper class, most middle and lower class citizens were Canadians. They worked as shopkeepers, bakers, blacksmiths, dressmakers, and grocers. Some managed well since their skills were needed, while others made just enough money to feed and clothe their families, while others managed better. Some people found work as domestic servants, such as housekeepers and nannies. People who worked as servants worked long hours and had little time for their families. Sadly, slavery did exist in the Canadas. Between 1671 and 1833, about 4,200 people were enslaved. Two-thirds were actually First Nations peoples, and the remaining third were black. Slaves were considered property. They could be bought, sold, and even handed down to the children of the slave owners. Most enslaved people worked as domestic servants in wealthy households in towns. They lived in their masters' houses and were closely supervised. Lieutenant Governor Simcoe passed the 1793 Act to limit slavery, which made it illegal to bring new slaves into Upper Canada. However, existing slaves were not given their freedom until 1833 when Britain made slavery illegal. This is a sad truth, but in a number of newspapers printed in Upper and Lower Canada between the late 1700s and 1833, you would see publications like this, these ads, which started off to be sold. And you can go on Google and you can get larger sized images so that you can see just how harmful these ads were. But for right now, what does the publication of this ad tell you about Canadian society in the early 1800s? Something we'll talk about tomorrow. In the early 1800s, towns were exciting to live in, but they were also dirty, crowded, and crime-ridden. There was no sewage treatment or garbage collection, so the air smelled bad. Without water filtration plants, the water carried diseases. Houses were not built like they are today. Many buildings were made of wood and burned quickly if a fire broke out. Since buildings were so close to one another, a fire in one house spread quickly to other houses, meaning that a whole neighborhood was in jeopardy. Just take a look at this painting on the left. How effective do you think are the firefighting equipment and strategies being used by the soldiers? People living in towns were in constant danger of catching deadly contagious diseases, such as smallpox. Diseases were often carried to the Canadas by British settlers. These diseases were then spread through the air, dirty water, insects, and physical contact. Since people lived so close together in the towns and did not wash their hands, diseases spread very quickly and were difficult to control. In the early 1800s, the government did not provide important social services such as healthcare, education, and care of seniors. Instead, people organized themselves into groups to help one another. Churches provided social services for those in need and during times of crisis. The Catholic Church was highly involved in the communities of Lower Canada. Priests provided spiritual services, while nuns provided nursing and education services. Nuns were also responsible for the care of orphans. Just looking at this picture on the left, Notre Dame des Victoires is still open in Quebec City today. And in fact, I have gone on 3 field trips with the middle school to Quebec City over the past 15 years. And on each trip, we have always passed by this church. So the question I have for you is, what did the location of the church and the number of people outside suggest about the church's importance to the community? This is something which put the video on pause for so that you can take time to write down your thoughts because I want to talk about this tomorrow. All right, and we're actually going to finish today's lesson by discussing the following 3 questions. Number 1, what was one positive aspect about life in a town in the 1800s? 2, what was one negative aspect about life in the town in the 1800s? And finally, 3, can studying the lives of people in towns in the 1800s help us understand the challenges that people living in towns today have to face? So what you're going to do is you're going to put the video on pause so that you can reread and consider each question and write down your responses. If you don't feel ready to do this activity, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least 2 more times, and then when you're ready, put the video on pause. All right, I look forward to hearing everybody's responses to these three questions, as well as the questions which I placed throughout this video in tomorrow's class. But until then, this concludes today's video.